Today's video is probably one of the strangest stories I've ever told on this channel. America has seen its fair share of some pretty harsh and terrifying serial killers in the 1970s, such as cult leader Charles Manson, the Zodiac killer, Wayne Gacy, and Ted Bundy, to list just a few. But have you heard about the serial killer Richard Trenton Chase, who was also given the nickname the Vampire of Sacramento? Hi, I'm Zach and welcome to Rooted Expeditions. Today we will be diving into the life of the man who was known as the Vampire Killer, who went on a rampage killing 6 people in a span of just a month in 1977 and 1978. Hit that thumbs up and let's dive right into today's video. To really understand Richard Chase, we need to back up and look at his life before the murder spree even began. This will hopefully paint a picture and make more sense later on. Richard, growing up, developed what is called hypochondria. He frequently complained that his heart would stop beating on occasions or that someone had stolen his pulmonary artery. Oh my gosh. Okay, here we go. If you didn't know what hypochondria is, it is when somebody consistently thinks something is wrong with their health when really nothing is wrong at all. Richard would balance oranges on his head, believing that the vitamin C would be absorbed by his brain through diffusion. And on top of that, he was also convinced that his cranial bones had separated and were moving around. So what did he do? He took a razor and shaved his head so that he could observe this activity that he thought was going on with his body. At one point, Richard thought his mom was attempting to poison him, so he left and ended up moving into an apartment with his friends. Richard's roommates complained that he was always getting drunk and getting high on marijuana and LSD. He would also walk around the apartment naked, and not just even the apartment, he would walk out in public naked. At this point, Richard's roommates had enough and they tried to force him to leave, but he refused. So his roommates said, okay, well, we're not going to stay here then, and they left instead. At this point, Richard, now living alone, began capturing, killing, and disemboweling various animals, which he would then consume raw, sometimes mixing the raw organs with Coca-Cola in a blender and drinking the concoction. Chase believed that by consuming these creatures, he could keep his heart from shrinking. Remember, hypochondria. Several years later, in 1973, Richard was admitted to a psych ward for a brief period of time. Then, just 3 years later, in 1976, Richard, who was now 26 years old, was involuntarily committed into a mental institution when he was rushed to a hospital after injecting rabbit's blood into his veins. It gets worse. Okay, moving on. Richard at this time suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. The staff dubbed him the Dracula because of his obsession with blood. While he was in the institution, he drank the blood of 2 birds he caught through the window. He broke their nets and drank their blood. He also went as far as stealing used syringes to extract blood from therapy dogs. After several months, Richard was deemed no longer a danger to society, so he was released into his mother's custody in 1976. Richard's mother weaned him off medicine and arranged for him to live on his own again. He ended up sharing an apartment with roommates, but that was short-lived, as what happened before with his last roommates, they all moved out, leaving Richard once again alone on his own. In mid-1977, Richard was stopped and arrested on a reservation near Pyramid Lake, Nevada. When police came up to Richard, his body was covered from head to toe in blood, and a bucket of it was even discovered in his truck. No charges were filed because the blood was determined to be cow's blood. Again, going back to this man being obsessed with blood. On December 29, 1977, Richard was driving around and the worst thing imaginable happened. He had the urge to no longer kill any more animals, but instead he killed his first known victim in a drive-by shooting. Sadly, the victim was Ambrose Griffin, who was a 51-year-old engineer and a father of 2. Then 2 weeks later, he attempted to enter into a woman's home but was turned away because her doors were locked. Now, check this out. Later on, Richard told detectives that locked doors meant he wasn't welcomed, whereas unlocked doors meant he was welcomed. Okay, moving on. On one occasion, he was apprehended as he was chased away by a couple returning home after stealing their belongings. And it didn't just stop there. He also had urinated and defecated on their infant child's bed and clothing. On January 23, 1978, he broke into a house and shot Teresa Wallin 3 times. Teresa was 3 months pregnant at the time. He then, after she was dead, he assaulted her while at the same time stabbing her with a butcher's knife. He then removed several of her organs from her body and even drank her blood. He did a few other things that I will not mention that is pretty morbid. This is where later on he would soon get the name the Vampire Killer. Then, just 4 days later on the 27th, he broke into the home of Evelyn Maroth, who was 38. While in the home, he immediately came across her boyfriend, Danny Meredith, and shot him with his .22 handgun. He then took the .22 handgun and shot Evelyn, her 6-year-old son Jason, and her 22-month-old nephew David Ferreira, killing them all. Then, after everyone was dead in the house, Richard proceeded to assault Evelyn's body along with eating her corpse and drinking her blood. In the process of Richard doing all this, there was a knock on the door, and this startled him. It was actually a visitor stopping by to see Evelyn. Richard, in a panic, grabbed Danny's car keys and ran out the house with the 22-month-old David's corpse. He got in Danny's car and fled the scene. This visitor, shocked to seeing what was happening, went to the neighbor's house to let them know everything that they saw and what happened, and they ended up calling the police. It wasn't hard to link Richard to the crime scene because he had left complete handprints and shoe prints in Evelyn's blood that they discovered in her house. It didn't take long for police to catch up to Richard and arrest him. When police searched Richard's apartment, they discovered blood prints on the walls, on the floors, on the ceiling, even on the inside of the refrigerator, and on all of his eating and drinking utensils. After being caught and arrested, Richard was charged with 6 counts of murder in 1979. To avoid the death penalty, the defense sought a conviction for second-degree murder, which would result in a life sentence. Richard's history of mental illness and the suggestion that his crimes were not premeditated were central to their case. However, on May 8, 1979, a jury found Richard guilty of 6 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced him to death in the gas chamber, rejecting the defense argument that he was not guilty due to insanity. Because of the extremely violent and grisly nature of Richard's crime, his fellow inmates feared him, and according to prison officials, they frequently tried to persuade Richard to commit suicide. While incarcerated, Richard agreed to a series of interviews with Robert K. Ressler, in which he discussed his fears of Nazis and UFOs, claiming that even though he had killed people, it was not his fault. He claimed he had been forced to kill people to keep himself alive, which he believed anyone would have done. What? While in an interview, he asked Robert for permission to use a radar gun to apprehend Nazi UFOs so that the Nazis could stand trial for the murders. And with Richard's delusional mind, he also gave Robert a large amount of macaroni and cheese that he had been stashing in his pants pockets, believing that the prison officials were working with the Nazis to poison him. Then on December 26, 1980, Richard was discovered dead in his prison cell. An autopsy later revealed that he had committed suicide by overdosing on prescription medications. Let me know what you think of this case. That does it for today's video. Hit that thumbs up. God bless.